You know I'm about to drop a truth bomb on you, and I'm dressed like Lewis from Left 4 Dead. That's when that's when you know that shit's getting serious. Okay. There are a lot of anti-nuclear organizations across the globe. Greenpeace, the CND, Friends of the Earth, and more are all Earth-spanning organizations that share a common message of being opposed to all things nuclear. On paper, you might think that that really isn't such a bad thing, and you'd be right. Anti-nuclear as a term evokes thoughts of groups that are peaceful against the manufacturing of nuclear weapons, which they almost always are. Greenpeace specifically describes nuclear weapons as the most destructive, indiscriminate, and monstrous ones ever produced, which is provably true. I mean, I can think of two specific instances that really cemented nuclear weapons as being kind of a shitty deal. You know? But for most of these organizations, that is where the truth stops when it comes to the discussion of all things nuclear. You see, these organizations don't exist purely as pro-disarmament groups, but also anti-nuclear power ones. Whether their interest in preserving public health is genuine or not isn't something that I'm going to be discussing in this video, because I believe, at least on the surface, they do have a genuine interest in protecting people and the environment. However, I do believe that their blind resistance to nuclear energy is putting that very goal in jeopardy. The CND, for example, describes nuclear power as dirty, dangerous, and economically unsustainable, while Greenpeace swears to fight vigorously against the construction of nuclear reactors. Green America, which is another group, is apparently suggesting that electric cars are a sufficient alternative to nuclear energy. Yeah, I'm not really sure what they're doing, but regardless of what those groups think should be done instead of transitioning to nuclear power, the truth remains that their stances on it are not only wrong, but could lead to an active worsening of the global climate. The first goal of this video is to dispel, or at least explain away, some of the biggest fears surrounding nuclear power. That's not to say that all the concerns are objectively false, because that's not true. There is some genuine worry to be had when it comes to using nuclear energy to power our world, but I hope to at least, start alleviating those concerns today. By the way, you like the scene changes? I'm in my kitchen now. Isn't that cool? Doesn't that make you want to keep learning about nuclear power? Yay! Starting off, I'd like to look at the CND's 4 main big scary reasons why nuclear energy isn't good. I feel like this is probably the best way to go about what I'm trying to go about here, because I believe that these 4 points represent almost every major conversation topic that comes out of the anti-nuclear crowd. And so by maybe, doing my best to refute those, I can refute most of what you'll hear from that side of the ideological spectrum. Let's take it from the top, with the CND's first point that the costs of running a nuclear reactor are way too high for it to ever be feasible. It is true that the startup costs of nuclear energy are expensive. On average, the startup cost of a nuclear power plant accounts for almost 60% of its lifetime expenses, which is, kind of a lot. However, when compared with other costs, especially those involved in actually running a nuclear reactor, such as maintenance and system expenses, that cost levels out quite a bit. And more recently, the capital and startup costs themselves have been reduced as well. The World Nuclear Association published a paper titled Nuclear Power Economics and Project Structuring in early 2017, which states that the escalation of nuclear capital costs in some countries, more apparent than real given the paucity of new reactor construction and the introduction of new designs, has peaked in the opinion of the IEA. In countries where continuous development programs have been maintained, capital costs have been contained and, in the case of South Korea, even reduced. Over the last 15 years, global median construction periods have fallen as well. Once a nuclear power plant has been constructed, the production cost of electricity is low and predictably stable. The startup costs of new plants have peaked. It can't get more expensive and will only continue to get cheaper as time passes, a process which can be accelerated by simply building more plants. The only entity the CND should be blaming for high costs is organizations like itself, which is directly responsible for halting and slowing the production of nuclear power plants, thus causing costs to increase. It's like me turning my car on in my closed garage and then writing an article about how garages are evil because mine killed me. Capital costs obviously aren't the only expenses involved in running a nuclear reactor, however. Maintenance costs are much easier for me to talk about because they're flat out cheaper when compared to coal and natural gas, between 33 to 50% cheaper than the cost of a coal-fired power plant, and between 20 to 25% cheaper than the cost of a gas combined cycle plant. Nuclear power is also much more stable than its alternatives, being only slightly affected by changes of up to 50% in the cost of fuel, whereas gas and coal are both significantly affected price-wise as a result of changes as little as 10%. When it comes to maintenance costs, nuclear energy is the clear winner when compared to more environmentally destructive fuel choices. In addition, most of these cost points are shaken up even further when you start to consider zero-emission tax credits. Multiple United States are beginning to implement policies that reward energy manufacturers when they don't produce any carbon emissions. These credits have already enabled plants in places like Illinois and New York to continue operation when they would have otherwise closed. Brattle Group talked about zero-emission credits in nuclear energy in 2016, saying, quote, "The actual near-term shortfall for a distressed nuclear power plant tends to be relatively modest, typically around $10 per megawatt hour, which translates to $12 to $20 per ton of avoided CO2, depending on the size of the shortfall and the carbon intensity of the affected region." It said, adding, "This cost compares favorably with other carbon abatement options, the estimated social cost of carbon, and the cost of state policies designed to reduce CO2 emissions from the power sector." The report continued, quote, "These findings demonstrate that the retention of existing nuclear generation plants, even at a modest premium, represents a cost-effective method to avoid CO2 emissions and enable compliance with any future climate policy at a reasonable cost. Sustaining nuclear viability in the interim will produce near-term emissions and is a reasonable and cost-effective insurance policy in the longer term." To conclude with this point, the CND is accurate in stating that nuclear energy might not necessarily be the cheapest way to power our world. However, it's also far from the most expensive or the most cost inefficient. The belief that nuclear power presents an outrageous cost to the consumer is not a belief that should continue being entertained. As it pertains to the CND, I believe that their labeling of nuclear power as expensive and treating that claim with as much weight as they do only serves to reinforce a pretty unfair perspective on the economic viability of nuclear energy. In the words of Donald Trump, not good. Now to the CND's next point, that being that nuclear power is a dirty, environmentally unfriendly source of energy. This one is, slightly easier to cover than the last point. The CND's website claims that there is still no safe, long-term solution for storing radioactive nuclear waste. This is false. It is just objectively false. According to the World Nuclear Organization, only 3% of total waste produced by nuclear reactors is high-level waste, which means waste with potentially dangerous levels of radiation. Directly from their website, the generation of electricity from a typical 1,000 megawatt nuclear power station, which would supply the needs of more than 1 million people, produces only 3 cubic meters of vitrified high-level waste per year if the used fuel is recycled. In comparison, a 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power station produces approximately 300,000 tons of ash and more than 6 million of carbon dioxide every year. Wow, I wonder if the worst president in United States history said anything weirdly true about nuclear waste. Wouldn't that be crazy? Wouldn't that be just up a little bit? Right now, countries that rely heavily on coal for their energy are ejecting millions upon millions of tons of fumes into the atmosphere. Compare that to the waste produced by a nuclear reactor, which can be measured in cubic meters. Single-digit cubic meters, no less. Not only is the amount of dangerous nuclear waste incredibly small, it's also almost entirely recyclable. Yeah, multiple organizations dedicated to preserving the environment and reducing climate change have conveniently forgotten about recycling, the thing that every single green organization has advocated for since nature became a thing. Okay, just relax a second. You can't yell at the people that you're trying to teach shit to. That's not very nice. Wouldn't you agree? That was a little uncalled for. It's time for a science lesson. The way that normal nuclear reactors work is as follows. Uranium is extracted from a mine somewhere on Earth and is then put through a refinery process at an enrichment plant that, enriches it after which point it's sent off to a nuclear reactor. I'm not going to bother explaining how a nuclear reactor works in detail, because I don't really get it either, so here are a bunch of graphs and other zany pictures to show you that it is, in fact, a complicated process. Eventually, once it's done with all that crazy shit, what remains is some pretty serious waste, especially uranium, plutonium, and various fissile materials. These materials are basically just materials that allow a nuclear reaction to happen. This waste obviously isn't good, but it's a problem with existing and functional solutions that the CND has just decided to overlook for some reason. Already, methods involving the closing of the fuel cycle have been devised and are already being implemented in countries in Europe and across the globe. According to What is Nuclear, closing the fuel cycle involves recycling the nuclear waste as new fuel. Since the main component of nuclear waste is uranium-238, which can be transmuted to plutonium, especially with breeder reactors, we can get more energy out of the waste than in a once-through cycle. The recycling plant separates the good stuff from the bad stuff. The bad stuff is mostly fission products, the atoms that a uranium atom becomes after it splits in the fission process. These fission products mostly decay to safe levels within 300 to 500 years, which is significantly shorter than standard nuclear waste. So, by closing the fuel cycle with standard reactors, we address the issue of nuclear waste identified in the once-through cycle. That sounds, pretty good, right? But let's say recycling isn't for you. I get it. I don't think putting your Coke Zero bottle in the blue bin is going to solve climate change either, but there are plenty of other ways to effectively mitigate the risk posed by nuclear reactors that aren't just recycling it. The Deep Isolation startup in California, for example, has devised a method to permanently seal these leftover fissile materials within the Earth without drilling massive holes into it like what was previously thought to be necessary. The company's founder, Elizabeth Muller, states that horizontal directional drilling has come a long way recently. This is now an off-the-shelf technology. Using larger canisters, we think about 300 boreholes with tunnels up to 2 miles long would be able to take much of the US's high-level nuclear waste. We think we can reduce by 2/3 the cost of permanent storage. Alongside this disposal plan, a bunch of other ideas ranging from realistic to absolutely insane have been postulated to solve the problem of nuclear waste. Things like shooting it into space, isolating it in synthetic rock, burying it in ice sheets, dumping it on the world's most isolated islands, and dropping it to the bottom of the world's deepest ocean trenches have all been proposed. In 2018, French Nobel Prize-winning physicist Gerard Mourou said that we should use lasers that are millions of times more powerful than the sun to rearrange the atoms of fissile materials and make them not radioactive anymore. There are an insane amount of workable solutions being proposed, meaning even the leftover fissile materials that come about as a result of recycling can be taken care of. The claim that we have so much nuclear waste and no idea what to do with it is literally completely false. We have so many ideas that it would be physically impossible to implement all of them. All right, we're halfway done. We're halfway done with what the CND has to say. Are you excited for point number 3? Because I am not particularly. The CND's third point is the often repeated claim that nuclear power is just way too dangerous to consider. From what I'm reading on their website, I believe that this point is specifically talking about the dangers of nuclear power to plant employees and not just random people living on Earth, so I'll talk about them first. I'll just get this point out of the way. Yes, nuclear meltdowns are indeed bad. I'm not trying to invent some secret health benefit from being involved in a nuclear accident, because obviously no such thing exists. I will, however, be attempting to prove that the worries about these catastrophic accidents are pretty overhyped, for lack of a better word. When it comes down to it, the likelihood of a nuclear accident is so insanely low that it's not really something worth worrying about in the first place. Only 2 major, and major means an incident with a rating over 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, accidents have occurred over 18,500 cumulative reactor years of operation. Only 2 incidents have exposed the general populace to radiation levels higher than you're exposed to by just existing on Earth. 2. In fact, since Fukushima Daiichi in 2011, almost all nuclear energy administrations have implemented SAMs, or Severe Accident Mitigation Protocols, to be enacted in case of a disaster. Already, you can see that the problems leading to these disasters were infinitely rare to begin with, and are only getting rarer with the development of safety protocols that granted, probably should have existed a long time ago, but they're here now, and they're making nuclear power plants a safer place to exist and work around. The CND also mentions risk of cancer as a result of working in close proximity to nuclear materials for extended periods of time. However, a study published by the British Journal of Cancer in 2013 showed that, in fact, for some reason, Canadian workers were at a lower risk of cancer than the general populace. Canadian workers had lower all-cause and solid cancer mortality compared with the similar age, sex, and calendar time-adjusted general Canadian population. AECL workers' all-cause mortality and solid cancer mortality were similar to that of all other workers and were significantly lower when compared with the general population of Canada. There was no difference between SMRs for all-cause mortality and solid cancer mortality by sex or start of first monitoring. Mortality from all leukemia, leukemia excluding CLL, and non-Hodgkin lymphoma was also lower compared with the general Canadian population. Hodgkin's disease and multiple myeloma had less than 10 deaths in the cohort from 1956 to 1994, so were not included in the analysis. We noted an increased SMR for all leukemia among early AECL workers, but it was not statistically significant and was based on a small number of cases. Cancer as a result of working within nuclear power plants is definitely something that plant administrators should take into consideration, but it's definitely not something that regular people, or even, in most cases, power plant employees themselves, should be worrying about. Now, let's talk about the general public. The way that the CND phrases the point they're making makes it seem as though the development of nuclear energy is just going to lead to massive piles of radioactive goop everywhere, spreading across the Earth, encasing everyone in toxic sludge, which, you know, is a pretty scary thought, but fret not, it's just not happening. We already discussed the incredibly low amount of actually dangerous waste compared to the total waste produced by nuclear reactors, but even with that number in mind, just how dangerous is high-level nuclear waste? Well, the average dose received from the public from nuclear power is about 0.0002 millisieverts per year, which is of the order of 10,000 times smaller than the total yearly dose received by the public from background radiation. The truth is, radiation from radioactive waste simply isn't enough to cause genuine harm to you or I. In addition, even the radiation from high-level nuclear waste will be reduced from safe levels within a few hundred years. That may sound like a lot, but considering the general public is never going to be, staring down a pile of radioactive material anyway, the risk is even lower. Now for the last point made by the CND, the one that I consider the funniest of the four, and also the stupidest of the four. I mean, I want to spend as little time talking about it as possible because I don't even want to entertain the concept that they're bringing up with this point, but essentially what they're saying is nuclear power and nuclear weapons share a common technological basis, and nuclear power and nuclear weapons are mutually beneficial. Starting off with the point about them sharing a common technological basis, that's true if by common technological basis you mean involves uranium at some point during its processes. The Hill published an article in 2017 literally called "Time to Stop Confusing Nuclear Weapons and Nuclear Power," in which they detailed the core differences that prove how different the two truly are. Neither the physics nor the technologies are the same, nor are the institutions that manage the two technologies. Nuclear weapons today involve fusing two atoms together in an uncontrolled explosion. Nuclear energy involves harnessing the decay of naturally occurring radioactive elements in a slow and controlled reaction, creating heat that turns steam turbines. I could not have put it any better myself. There is no technological similarity beyond the fact that both have something to do with nuclear materials at some point during their creation. The production processes are different, the ways in which they harness the power of nuclear energy are drastically different, and it is nearly impossible for the two to be conflated once you look at the actual science. With this odd and misinformed point out of the way, it's time to wrap up this section of the video.
This is me editing this video, long after it's been recorded, and I just want to say that if you made it this far, and were able to get past my annoying cadence, then thank you. Because I was originally planning on the video ending here, but I figured that there was more that needed to be said. So, if you want to watch the epilogue, it's happening right now.
This portion of the video will most likely be much shorter than the previous one, since I have a lot less ground I need to cover here. I'm writing this portion of the video under the assumption that you bought at least 50 to 75% of what I said in the last section, because, you know, you could have just completely not and ignored everything I said, which, fair, I mean, but in this section, I'm going to try to prove why nuclear is superior to other forms of renewables, rather than just trying to prove it's not as bad as everybody says it is, like I was doing in the last section. I think that may prove to be a bit of a bigger challenge than the last part, but also one that'll take a lot less time to explain. Where do solar panels go when they die? Do windmills really cross the Rainbow Bridge into the butterfly farm when their blades can't keep spinning anymore? These questions are all very important when considering the environmental impacts of quote-unquote renewable sources of energy. By 2050, the International Renewable Energy Agency predicts that up to 78 million metric tons of solar panels will have reached the end of their life, and that the world will be generating about 6 million metric tons of new solar e-waste annually. The World Count says that e-wastes are buried or incinerated in landfills where their toxins pollute our land, air, and water. Most of the time, they're sent to developing countries where workers extract the precious metals from the discarded electronics. Workers on e-waste sites are paid an average of $1.50 a day. The construction of solar panels leads to environmental destruction. It may not seem like it, but it does. Nuclear should already be preferable because at no point in its life cycle is it this actively destructive. We already talked about how nuclear waste could be measured in matters of cubic feet, which once again gives it the edge over other forms of renewable energy. Wind turbines, too, create much more landfill-occupying waste than nuclear. Wind turbine graveyards, like the one in Casper, Wyoming, which is right next to me, are popping up more and more around the country due to the incredible difficulty involved in recycling them. Recycling? Recycling, you say? I specifically remember saying something about recycling earlier. It's almost as if nuclear energy is nearly completely recyclable when you compare it to other renewable sources of energy, meaning it has even less of an environmental impact. Wow, that is insane! If only somebody had thought of that before! Supporting the so-called renewable alternatives to nuclear power means supporting the creation of millions upon millions of tons of e-waste across the United States and the world. Nuclear actually wins the waste debate, which is completely contrary to what anti-nuclear advocates want you to believe. Next, let's talk about time. The production of electronic waste, which suspiciously resembles the garbage I see on my Twitter timeline every day, is only further exacerbated by the incredibly short lifespans of other forms of renewable energy. Wind and solar constructions both last about 20 to 30 years on average, while nuclear reactors can last up to 80 or longer. According to Energy.gov, as the average age of American reactors approaches 40 years old, experts say there are no technical limits to these units churning out clean and reliable energy for an additional 40 years or longer. 2 nuclear reactors in Turkey have already hit their 80th birthdays and are projected to continue operating for up to a decade into the future. Windmills and solar panels will be scrapped over 4 times over during the life cycle of one nuclear reactor. I am genuinely, by this point, struggling to understand how any other source of renewable energy has even gotten off the ground at this point. Like, they just kind of suck. That was a little far. I'm kidding, obviously. Almost every form of energy has its merits. Yeah, even coal and oil and all that nasty shit. And I would even argue that there aren't many forms of energy that you should be outright against the construction of. Except hydropower. No hydropower. It kills the fish. However, I obviously do believe that nuclear power is the best option, and I also hope that some of the points I made in this video will maybe convince some of those anti-nuclear fanatics to turn away from their devilish ways and into that glowing radioactive green light